The shot cracked across the dusty street like a whip, and every bird in Willow Creek took to the sky at once. Down below, Penelope Foster stood holding a torn piece of paper. It was supposed to be her wedding invitation. Now it was just trash, fluttering in the dead Montana air. She'd traveled 1,000 miles for a wedding that wasn't going to happen. 1,000 miles, just to be told in front of the whole town that she was too big, too substantial, to be a proper bride for any man. The man who'd fired the shot, Xander Morgan, slowly lowered his Colt revolver. The smoke curled from the barrel, smelling of sulfur and finality. He hadn't planned on riding into town today, and he sure as hell hadn't planned on walking into this particular brand of cruelty. But he wasn't the kind of man to stand by while some fancy Eastern fool tore a woman's soul to pieces for sport. "That's enough," Xander's voice rolled across the silent street. It wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of a man who knew the frontier, who'd faced down worse things than a loudmouth in a clean suit. He was tall, broad, with a dark beard and eyes the color of a coming storm. He looked at the well-dressed man on the boardwalk, the man who had just shattered Penelope's world. "This isn't your business, cowboy," sneered Charles Whitfield, the banker's son. The man who'd sent for Penelope, sight unseen, only to cast her aside like a sack of unwanted grain. "You made it everyone's business," Xander said, his hand resting easy on the gun still holstered at his hip. "When you decided to shame a lady in public. Where I come from, a man's word is his bond." Penelope was frozen. Tears traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was a tall woman, with curves that her simple traveling dress couldn't hide. She was, as Charles had so cruelly pointed out, larger than the other women in town. But there was nothing about her that deserved this. Nothing at all. "She misrepresented herself," Charles protested, waving a dismissive hand at her. "Look at the state of her. I can't be saddled with that." Xander's jaw went tight as iron. He didn't look at Charles. He looked right at Penelope. "Miss," he said, his voice dropping a little. "My ranch is 3 miles out of town. The Starlight Ranch. You're welcome to stay there. Figure things out. No strings." Penelope wiped at her tears, her blue eyes filled with suspicion. "I don't even know you, sir." "Xander Morgan," he said, tipping his hat just slightly. "Ask anyone in town. No woman should be left stranded." Charles let out a sharp, ugly laugh. "Taking my leftovers, Morgan. I always knew you had poor taste." In a flash, Xander crossed the space between them. He didn't draw his gun. He just grabbed Charles by the lapels of his expensive coat and lifted him half off his feet. "One more word," Xander growled, his voice low and dangerous, "and you'll be spitting teeth." A woman from the crowd, Mrs. Holloway, the town seamstress, stepped forward and put a gentle hand on Penelope's arm. "He's a good man, dear. I've known Xander his whole life. You can't stay at the hotel. Not now. You go with him." Penelope looked at Charles, who couldn't even meet her eyes. Then she looked at the tall, grim-faced cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere to defend her. In his eyes, she didn't see pity. She saw something else, something like recognition. It made no sense, but it was enough. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I accept." An hour later, they were in his wagon, rattling out of town. Her 2 trunks were tied down in the back. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clop of the horses and the creak of the wheels. "I don't know how to thank you," Penelope said finally. "No need," Xander replied, his eyes fixed on the trail. "What he did was wrong." Penelope smoothed the fabric of her skirt over her lap. "He wasn't wrong about everything, though. I am larger than most women." Xander's eyes flickered to her, just for a second. "There's nothing wrong with how you look, Miss Foster. Some men are just too small to see real beauty." The words, so simple and direct, brought fresh tears to her eyes. She blinked them back hard. She wouldn't cry anymore. To change the subject, she asked, "Have you lived here long?" "Born and raised," he said. "My pa built the ranch. It's mine now." "I'm from Philadelphia," she offered. "A school teacher. Or I was. Before you decided to marry a man you'd never met," Xander finished for her. It wasn't a question. Penelope flushed. "It sounds foolish." "Not foolish," he said, surprising her. "Brave. It takes courage to chase a new life." He said the words strangely, as if they had a hidden meaning she couldn't quite grasp. Then they crested a hill, and the Starlight Ranch spread out below them. It was beautiful, a sturdy house and a big barn nestled in a green valley. "It's home," Xander said. But as they got closer, Penelope noticed something odd. There were men with rifles patrolling the fence line. Not cowboys. Guards. And that was the first sign that Xander Morgan's ranch was more than just a home. It was a fortress. A woman named Martha greeted them at the door, her eyes kind but her smile tight. She showed Penelope to a guest room upstairs. It was simple, clean, but the window had a new-looking lock on it, one that could only be bolted from the outside. Penelope's hand went cold as she touched the heavy iron. This wasn't a guest room, it was a cage. Xander hadn't rescued her. He had captured her. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The kindness in town, the gentle words in the wagon. It was all a lie, a performance. But for what? Why bring her here? She tried the door. It was unlocked, for now. Downstairs, she could hear Xander talking to Martha in low, urgent tones. She couldn't make out the words, just the feeling behind them. It wasn't welcoming. It was tactical. "Can't have her wandering around," Xander was saying. "Not until we know for sure." "Know what for sure?" Martha asked. "She's just a heartbroken woman from the East, Xander." "No one is just anything, Martha. Not when the Whitfields are involved. Charles sending for a mail-order bride right now, of all times. It's not a coincidence. It's a move, and she's the chess piece." Penelope flattened herself against the wall, straining to hear. The Whitfields. Charles. This was all connected. Xander hadn't stumbled upon her humiliation by chance. He'd been looking for it. He'd been looking for her. She had to get out. But how? She was miles from town, with no horse and no idea which way to run. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and red. She crept back to her room, her mind racing. She had to search for answers. If Xander thought she was a pawn in some game against Charles Whitfield, then her only hope was to figure out the rules. That night, after a tense dinner where Xander watched her every move, she waited. She waited until the house was dark and silent, until the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Then she slipped out of her room. The floorboards creaked under her weight, each sound like a gunshot in the stillness. She made her way to a room at the end of the hall, the one Xander had passed by without comment. His office. The door was locked. Of course it was. But Penelope wasn't just a school teacher. Back in Philadelphia, she'd had a different life, one she'd run away from, a life that had taught her a few useful, if unladylike, skills. She pulled a hairpin from her hair, straightened it, and went to work on the lock. It took less than a minute. The lock clicked open with a soft snick. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The room smelled of leather and whiskey. A massive oak desk dominated the space. On it, lit by a sliver of moonlight from the window, was a map of the valley. Her eyes were drawn to the lines and markings all over it. The Starlight Ranch was outlined in blue, but cutting right through it, marked in angry red ink, was a proposed route for a new railroad spur. And the land designated for the depot, the most valuable piece of real estate in the whole valley, was the very spot where the ranch house stood. The plans were signed by the president of the railroad and countersigned by the sole financing partner, Charles Whitfield. Senior Charles hadn't just rejected her. He and his father were trying to ruin Xander. They wanted his land, and somehow she was tangled up in the middle of it. But that wasn't the biggest shock. Pinned to the wall behind the desk was a photograph. A younger Xander, smiling, his arm around a beautiful, dark-haired woman. And standing next to them, looking like the best of friends, was a smirking Charles Whitfield. They knew each other. They'd been friends. And the woman? Penelope felt a jolt of recognition. She'd seen her face before, in a locket. The locket Xander wore around his neck, tucked under his shirt. The one he sometimes touched without realizing it. The woman in the picture, the woman in the locket, was the reason for all of this. She was the ghost haunting the Starlight Ranch. And Penelope had a terrifying feeling she knew who she was. Xander's dead wife. And if the look in the photograph was any indication, Charles Whitfield had been in love with her too. This wasn't about land. Not entirely. This was about revenge. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. Penelope's blood ran cold. She hadn't heard anyone get up. She flattened herself against the wall, behind the heavy door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside the office. A key scraped in the lock. She was trapped. Whoever was out there was coming in. She glanced around the dark room, desperate for a weapon, for an escape. There was nothing, just the desk, the map, and the photograph of a dead woman. The door handle turned. The door swung open, and the hulking silhouette of a man filled the doorway. It wasn't Xander. It was Tobias, Martha's quiet, kind-eyed husband. But there was nothing kind in his eyes now. They were cold, hard chips of stone. He held an old Navy revolver in his hand, and it was pointed directly at Penelope's chest. "You shouldn't be in here, miss," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The boss doesn't like people snooping." Penelope stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. Tobias, the gentleman who tended the horses. He was one of Xander's guards, of course. How had she been so naive? I was lost," she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was looking for the washroom." Tobias didn't smile. He took a step into the room, his eyes scanning past her to the desk, to the incriminating map laid out in the moonlight. His gaze hardened. "Looks to me like you found exactly what you were looking for," he said. He raised the gun slightly. "Mr. Morgan is going to want to talk to you. Now!" He gestured with the revolver for her to walk out of the room. Penelope's mind raced. If she went with him, Xander would know she'd seen everything. He'd know she knew about the railroad, the land, the woman. Her pretense of being a helpless victim would be shattered. He might lock her in that room for good, or worse. She had to make a move. Now. As she stepped past him, she tripped, lurching forward and throwing all of her weight against his side. The move caught him by surprise. He stumbled, trying to keep his balance, and for a split second the gun wavered. It was the only chance she'd get. She brought her elbow up hard, jamming it into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip on the gun loosening. Penelope grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting with a strength born of pure terror. The revolver clattered to the floor. They both dove for it. Tobias was bigger, stronger, but Penelope was faster. Her fingers closed around the cold steel of the grip an instant before his. She scrambled backward, crab-walking away from him, bringing the heavy weapon up with a shaking hand. "Stay back," she warned, her voice ragged. Tobias rose to his feet, a dark expression on his face. He wasn't afraid. He was angry. "Give me the gun, girl. You're making a big mistake." The mistake was thinking I was just some helpless schoolteacher, she shot back, the weight of the gun giving her a sliver of courage. Now, you're going to tell me what's going on. Why am I really here? Before he could answer, another voice cut through the tension from the end of the hallway. She's here because I brought her here. Xander stood there, a lantern in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and the lantern light gleamed on the silver locket resting against his chest. He looked from the gun in Penelope's hand to Tobias, and a deep, weary sigh escaped his lips. "Put the gun down, Penelope," he said, his voice calm, but with an edge of command. "You're right. It's time we talked." Penelope hesitated, her gaze darting between the two men. She was cornered, but giving up the gun meant giving up her only leverage. "Not until he leaves," she said, nodding toward Tobias. "I'll talk to you. Alone." Xander held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt nod to Tobias. "Go on, check the perimeter." Tobias looked like he wanted to argue, but a single look from Xander silenced him. He gave Penelope one last dark glare, and then disappeared down the stairs. Now it was just the two of them, in the dark hallway, the secrets of the house hanging in the air between them. "My office?" Xander asked, gesturing toward the open door. She nodded, still not lowering the gun. "I saw the map. I saw the photograph." She took a breath. "And I know why you hate Charles Whitfield. It's because of her, isn't it? Your wife." Xander's face, illuminated by the lantern, became a mask of old pain. He didn't deny it. "Her name was Elena," he said, his voice rough. "And she wasn't my wife. She was my fiancée. And Charles was my best friend." He looked down at the floor, and for the first time, Penelope saw not a captor, not a ruthless rancher, but a man drowning in grief. "What happened to her?" Penelope asked, her voice softer now. Xander looked up, and the storm in his eyes was back, raging with a fury that made her take an involuntary step back. "He killed her," Xander said, the words dropping like stones in the silence. "Charles Whitfield murdered the woman I loved." The accusation hung in the air, so monstrous, so absolute, it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the hallway. Charles Whitfield, the preening, cowardly banker's son, a murderer. It didn't seem possible. "How?" Penelope whispered, the gun in her hand suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. "It was an accident," Xander said, his voice thick with a bitterness that time had not healed. "That's what they called it, a hunting trip, just the two of them. He said his rifle misfired, a stray shot. But I know Charles. He was jealous. Elena had chosen me over him, and he couldn't stand it. He took a step closer, and Penelope instinctively raised the gun again. He stopped. The law in this territory is owned by one man, Charles Whitfield, Sr. He made sure the investigation was quick. He made sure his son walked away without a single question asked. They buried the truth along with Elena. Now it was all starting to make a terrible kind of sense. The fortress-like ranch, the armed guards, Xander's obsessive hatred for the Whitfields. It was a private war, simmering for years, and now it was about to boil over. "So you brought me here," Penelope said, thinking aloud. "You saw Charles reject me in town, and you thought, what? That I would help you, that I'd be your weapon against him." "I didn't know what to think," Xander admitted, running a hand through his dark hair. "It was too convenient. Charles hasn't shown his face in Willow Creek for over a year. Then he suddenly sends for a bride, a woman from the East, and makes a public spectacle of rejecting her on the very day I'm in town. It felt like a trap. I thought maybe his father had sent you, to spy on me, to get inside my ranch." "So you rescued me to see what I was up to," Penelope finished, a cold anger replacing her fear. "You locked me in. The lock on your window is for keeping people out, Penelope, not in. The Whitfields have tried to get to me before, through my land, my water rights. They've sent men. I brought you here to protect you, until I could figure out if you were a part of their plan." "And what have you decided?" she challenged. He looked at her, at the gun held steady in her hand, at the defiant look in her eyes. A slow, weary smile touched his lips. "I've decided that Charles Whitfield Sr. would never be smart enough to hire someone like you," he said. "Now will you please put down the revolver? It's making me nervous." Slowly, carefully, Penelope lowered the gun and placed it on a small table by the wall. The immediate danger had passed, but the situation was more complicated than ever. She wasn't a prisoner, but she was far from free. She was a piece on a board in a game she didn't understand, caught between a man bent on revenge and a family that seemed to own the entire territory. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Xander said, his eyes turning hard again. "Now you have a choice. I can give you a horse and enough money to get you anywhere you want to go. You can ride out of here at dawn and never look back. Forget you ever saw Willow Creek." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. "Or," he continued, his voice dropping low, "you can stay. You can help me finish what Charles started. Help me get justice for Elena. Help me burn the Whitfield empire to the ground." The choice he offered was no choice at all. Run, and be looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life, wondering if the Whitfields would see her as a loose end. Or stay, and throw her lot in with a man whose grief had sharpened him into a weapon. But as she looked at him, she saw the photograph in her mind's eye, the happiness in his face, the love for the woman beside him. And she thought of the public humiliation she had suffered at Charles's hands. He hadn't just insulted her, he had tried to erase her, to make her worthless. Maybe justice for Elena was also, in a way, justice for herself. "If I stay," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I'm not your pawn. I'm your partner. We do this together. My way." Xander looked surprised, then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. "All right, Miss Foster," he said, extending a hand. "Partner, what's your plan?" Penelope didn't take his hand. "Not yet." "My plan," she said, a dangerous glint in her eye, "starts with a visit to the one person in town who hates the Whitfields as much as you do, but is too afraid to show it. Mrs. Patterson, at the general store." A week later, Penelope walked into the Willow Creek General Store. This time she wasn't a frightened, humiliated woman. She walked with a purpose that made heads turn. She'd spent the last 7 days at the Starlight Ranch, not as a guest or a prisoner, but as a strategist. She and Xander had talked for hours, piecing together everything they knew. His knowledge of the Whitfields' business dealings, their strong-arm tactics, their political connections. Her sharp mind, which saw patterns and openings he had missed in his grief-fueled obsession. They had a plan, and it was bold. Mrs. Patterson was behind the counter, dusting tins of peaches. She looked up as Penelope entered, her expression wary. The whole town was still buzzing about the rancher, Xander Morgan, taking in the rejected mail-order bride. "Miss Foster," she said, her voice neutral. "Mrs. Patterson," Penelope replied, walking straight to the counter. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "I know you and your husband took out a loan from the Whitfield Bank 5 years ago to expand this store, a loan you've been struggling to repay ever since, thanks to the exorbitant interest rates Mr. Whitfield keeps adding on." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I also know," Penelope continued, ignoring the denial, "that the freight company that brings your supplies is also owned by the Whitfields, and that lately your shipments have been late, damaged, driving your prices up and your customers away. He's squeezing you out. He wants this store." The older woman's hands trembled. "Who told you this?" Xander Morgan has been fighting the Whitfields for years, Penelope said simply. He makes it his business to know who else they're targeting. He thought you might be ready to fight back. Mrs. Patterson looked around the empty store. Her husband was in the back, trying to salvage a crate of water-damaged flour. She looked at Penelope, at the fire in the younger woman's eyes. Fight back? With what? She whispered. He's the richest man in the territory. He owns the sheriff, the judge. He doesn't own the truth, Penelope said. We have reason to believe that Charles Whitfield Sr. is using his bank and his businesses to run a massive fraud scheme. He's forging documents, creating fake debts, and using them to seize land from ranchers and business owners all over this valley. Land the railroad is about to make very, very valuable. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. We need proof, records, ledgers, anything that shows a pattern. You're a respected member of this town. People trust you. They'll talk to you. It was a huge risk. If Mrs. Patterson went to the Whitfields, the entire plan would be exposed. But Xander and Penelope were gambling on one thing, that the fear of ruin was finally less than the hope of freedom. Mrs. Patterson was silent for a long time. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. My cousin Clara works as a clerk at the bank, she said, her voice barely audible. She hates the Whitfields. She's seen things, but she's terrified of losing her job. Tell her she's not alone anymore, Penelope said. Tell her a storm is coming for the Whitfields, and she can either be swept away with them, or she can help us build the Ark. That night, a package was delivered to the Starlight Ranch. It was a ledger, smuggled out of the bank by Clara. It was exactly what they needed. Page after page showed discrepancies. Loans marked as defaulted when ranchers had records of payment. Forged signatures on deeds transferring property. It was a detailed blueprint of the Whitfields' criminal enterprise. This is it, Xander breathed, his hand tracing a column of figures. This is enough to hang him. It's not enough to have proof, Penelope said, her mind already working on the next step. We have to get it into the right hands. The territorial governor is in Helena. But he's a friend of the Whitfields. Going to him is a death sentence. So what do? We don't go to the law, Penelope said, a cunning smile on her face. We go to the press. There's a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, a man named Frederick James. He made his name exposing corrupt railroad barons in California. He despises men like Whitfield. She looked at Xander. We need to get this ledger and our story to him, and I know just how to do it. 2 days later, Charles Whitfield Jr. received a letter. It was from Penelope. The note was short and to the point. It said that she had come into possession of some items that belonged to his father. Items he would be very interested in getting back. She proposed a meeting. Midnight, at the old abandoned church outside of town. He was to come alone. It's a trap, Charles said, throwing the letter onto his father's desk. She's working with Morgan. Charles Whitfield, Sr., a man whose cold eyes matched the winter sky, picked up the letter. He read it, then a slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. Of course it's a trap, you fool, he said to his son. And we're going to spring it. He looked at his son with open contempt. You started this mess, bringing that woman here. Her public rejection made Morgan notice her. It made him take her in. Now you're going to fix it. You will go to the meeting. But you won't be alone. Midnight at the old church was as dark as the inside of a grave. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only sound was the wind moaning through the broken steeple. Penelope waited inside, holding a lantern. Xander and 2 of his most trusted men, including Tobias, were hidden in the shadows of the graveyard, rifles ready. The plan was simple. When Charles arrived, they would apprehend him. They would use him as leverage to force a confession from his father, which they would then send with the ledger to the reporter in San Francisco. Headlights cut through the darkness. A single carriage was coming up the road. It stopped a short distance from the church. The door opened, and Charles Whitfield stepped out. He was alone. He walked toward the church, his steps hesitant. He looked small and afraid in the vast, dark landscape. Penelope held her breath. It was working. Charles reached the church door and pushed it open. "Miss Foster," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm here. I'm alone." "I see that," Penelope said, stepping out from behind a row of pews. The ledger was in a satchel at her feet. "Do you have what I asked for?" He was supposed to bring a signed document returning the deeds to 2 ranches the Whitfields had recently stolen, as a sign of good faith. Charles nodded, holding up a roll of papers. "It's all here. Now give me what you have, and we can all walk away from this." Something was wrong. He was too calm, too compliant. Suddenly, from the darkness outside, a voice shouted, "Now!" Floodlights erupted from all sides of the church, bathing the building and the graveyard in a blinding white glare. Men poured out from behind the trees, all holding rifles. They weren't Xander's men. They were Whitfield's, at least a dozen of them. Gunshots exploded from the graveyard. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Xander and his men returned fire. It was an ambush. Charles dove to the floor as bullets tore through the thin walls of the church. Penelope threw herself behind the heavy oak pulpit, the satchel with the ledger clutched to her chest. The air filled with the roar of gunfire and the splintering of wood. She could hear men shouting, cursing, screaming. Then she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The heavy thud of the church doors being barred from the outside. They were trapped. And then she smelled it. Smoke. She peered over the top of the pulpit. Flames were licking up the far wall of the church. They hadn't just come to get the ledger. They had come to bury the evidence, and everyone with it. The old dry wood of the church caught fire with terrifying speed. Flames roared up the walls, eating through the roof. The air grew thick with choking smoke, and the heat was becoming unbearable. "We have to get out of here," Charles screamed, crawling toward her from behind a shattered pew. His face was white with terror. "They've barred the main doors," Penelope yelled back, her eyes streaming from the smoke. Outside, the gunfire had intensified. Xander and his men were caught in a brutal crossfire, pinned down. They couldn't get to the church. "There's a door behind the altar," Charles choked out. "It leads to the vestry." Penelope grabbed the satchel and scrambled toward the back of the church, Charles crawling right behind her. The roar of the fire was deafening, a hungry beast consuming everything around them. A burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, showering them with sparks and blocking the way they had just come. They reached the small, heavy door behind the altar. It was stuck. The wood had swollen in the frame. "Together!" Penelope shouted. They threw their shoulders against it. Once, twice. On the third try, the wood groaned and splintered, and the door flew open. They tumbled into the small, windowless room of the vestry, slamming the door shut behind them, temporarily sealing off the worst of the flames. They were safe from the fire, but they were still trapped. There was only one other way out, a small, barred window set high in the stone wall. "Give me a boost," Penelope said, already eyeing the window. Charles hesitated, his eyes flicking to the satchel she held. Greed and fear warred on his face. "What's in there that's so important you'd die for it?" he demanded. "Your father's confession," Penelope lied, her mind racing. "Signed and sealed. It details every crime, every swindle, including what really happened to Elena." Charles's face went slack with shock. What are you talking about?" Xander knows, Charles. He knows it wasn't a hunting accident. He knows you murdered her. No! Charles cried, staggering back. It wasn't like that. I loved her. You loved her, so you shot her. Penelope pressed, seeing the crack in his composure. This was her chance, not just to escape, but to break him. It was an accident, he insisted, his voice cracking. I just wanted to scare him. I fired wide. I didn't see her. She stepped out from behind a tree. I never meant to. Tears were streaming down his face now, mixing with the soot. He was collapsing, the guilt he'd carried for years finally crushing him. My father, he sobbed. He made me lie. He said it was the only way. He cleaned everything up. He threatened the sheriff. He said it would protect the family name. The gunfire outside suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire on the other side of the door. Then, a new voice called out, cold and commanding, from right outside the vestry walls. Charles, are you in there, boy? It was Charles Whitfield, Sr. He'd been here the whole time, orchestrating the attack. Charles Jr. froze, his face a mask of pure terror. He looked at his father's voice, then at Penelope. He's going to kill us both, Charles whispered. He won't leave any witnesses. He was right. Whitfield Sr. thought they were all trapped in the main part of the church, burning alive. But if he realized they were still alive in the vestry, he would make sure they never got out. Penelope looked at the barred window, at the terrified, broken man in front of her, then at the satchel in her hand. She had the ledger. She had a confession, albeit a verbal one. But she was about to be buried alive. The window, she said, her voice hard as steel. Help me with the bars, now, or we both die in here. Panic gave Charles a surge of adrenaline. He grabbed a fallen candelabra from the floor and used it as a crowbar, jamming it between the stone and the old rusted iron bars. Penelope added her weight, pulling and twisting. The mortar was old. It began to crumble. One by one, the bars groaned and came loose. Outside, they could hear Whitfield Sr. shouting orders. Spread out! Find Morgan's body! I want him found! They had one last chance. The final bar came free. The opening was small, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. You first, Penelope said to Charles. Get out and run. Draw their fire. It's the only way one of us gets away with this. She held up the satchel. Charles looked at her, his eyes wide. He understood. It was a suicide mission. But it was also his only chance at redemption. He looked at the satchel, at the evidence of his father's evil, and then at the memory of Elena in his mind. He finally made a choice that wasn't selfish. He nodded. Tell Xander. Tell him I'm sorry. Then he scrambled through the window and dropped to the ground outside. Over here, he screamed, running away from the church, toward the dark woods. He's getting away. Immediately, shouts and gunfire erupted from the other side of the church as Whitfield's men took the bait. They thought it was Xander escaping. It was the diversion Penelope needed. She shoved the satchel through the window, then squeezed herself through the narrow opening, dropping to the soft earth below. She stayed low, hidden in the shadows of the church wall, listening to the sounds of Charles being hunted in the woods. A single final gunshot echoed through the trees, then silence. Tears pricked Penelope's eyes. Charles had been a coward and a fool, but in the end he had done the right thing. She couldn't wait. She grabbed the satchel and sprinted in the opposite direction of the chase, melting into the darkness. She didn't know where Xander was, if he was alive or dead. All she knew was that she had the ledger, and she had to get it out of Willow Creek. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, finally collapsing in a ditch miles from the burning church. The glow from the fire stained the night sky behind her. She was alone. hunted, and holding the only thing that could burn down an empire. Just as she was about to get up and start running again, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Fast. She froze, pressing herself into the dirt, praying it wasn't one of Whitfield's men. The horse stopped just a few feet from her hiding place. A tall figure dismounted. In the faint starlight, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of Xander Morgan. He was alive. He was covered in dirt and blood, a nasty gash on his forehead. But he was alive. "Penelope!" he called out, his voice a ragged whisper. She let out a sob of relief and crawled out of the ditch. He saw her, and in 2 strides, he had her in his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I thought you were dead," he murmured into her hair. "I saw them bar the doors. I thought—" "Charles," she said, pulling back to look at him. "He helped me escape. They shot him." Xander's face was grim. He nodded slowly. "I heard. Tobias and the others are safe. We took out a few of Whitfield's men, but there were too many. We had to fall back." He looked at the satchel she was still clutching. "You got it?" She nodded. "I got it." "Then it wasn't for nothing," he said, his voice hard. "We have to ride, now. Whitfield will have the whole territory looking for you by sunrise." They rode all night, pushing the horse to its limit, heading not for the Starlight Ranch, but east, toward the next territory. Toward a telegraph station that wasn't owned by the Whitfields. By the time the sun came up, they were miles away, hidden in a rocky canyon. They were exhausted, bruised, but they were together. And they had the weapon they needed. "I telegraphed Frederick James," Xander said, after returning from a small town a few miles away. "I sent him the whole story. The Ledger is on a stagecoach, under guard, on its way to San Francisco." "What now?" Penelope asked. "Now we wait," he said. "And we disappear. We can't go back to the ranch. Not yet. Whitfield will be looking for us." For the next 2 weeks, they lived like fugitives, moving from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a night. The hardship forged a new kind of bond between them. They were no longer just partners in a quest for vengeance. They were survivors. One evening, sitting by a small campfire under a blanket of stars, Penelope looked at the man beside her. The grief was still in his eyes, but it was joined by something else now. A glimmer of hope. "When this is over," she said quietly, "what will you do?" Xander looked at her, his expression serious. "I'm going to rebuild. Not just my ranch, my life, but I don't want to do it alone." He reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "You came into my life like a storm, Penelope Foster," he said. "You turned everything upside down. You're brave and smart, and you're the strongest person I've ever met. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you." Penelope's heart swelled. Through all the chaos and danger, the same truth had been growing in her own heart. She had come to Montana seeking a safe, simple life, and had instead found a dangerous, complicated man who saw her for exactly who she was. "I love you too, Xander Morgan," she said. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that wasn't about strategy or revenge, but about a promise of a future if they could just live long enough to claim it. A week later, it happened. The story broke in the San Francisco Chronicle. A front-page expose detailing the vast criminal conspiracy of Charles Whitfield, Sr., the forged deeds, the stolen land, the railroad scheme. It even included Charles Jr.'s deathbed confession about Elena, pieced together from Xander's account of Penelope's story. The article was a bombshell. It was picked up by newspapers across the country. The territorial governor, shamed by the national scandal, had no choice but to act. He sent U.S. Marshals to Willow Creek. They arrived to find Charles Whitfield, Sr., trying to flee. They arrested him, along with the corrupt sheriff and a dozen of his hired guns. The Whitfield empire crumbled overnight. The ranchers and townspeople whose land had been stolen got it back. The bank was put under new management. The cloud of fear that had hung over the valley for so long finally lifted. A month later, Xander and Penelope rode back into Willow Creek. But they didn't ride back as a rancher and a schoolteacher. They rode back as heroes. The whole town turned out to greet them. Mrs. Patterson ran from the general store and threw her arms around Penelope. The families of her students cheered. They rode up the long drive to the Starlight Ranch. It was just as they had left it, peaceful and beautiful in the afternoon sun. It was finally, truly, safe. That evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sunset. "It's over," Penelope said softly. "It's just beginning," Xander replied, turning to face her. He got down on one knee, pulling a small, simple ring from his pocket. "I know you're not the kind of woman who needs rescuing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm asking you to rescue me from living the rest of my life alone. Penelope Foster, will you marry me?" Tears of joy streamed down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course I will." He slid the ring onto her finger as the first stars of evening began to appear in the sky. They had both come to Montana looking for a new life and had found it in the most unexpected way. A rejected bride and a vengeful rancher who together had faced down corruption and found a love stronger than any lie. They proved that sometimes the most beautiful things can grow from the most broken ground, and that a person's true size isn't measured in inches, but in the courage of their heart. If you enjoyed this wild ride through the Old West, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and maybe share this story with a friend who loves a good tale of justice. You won't want to miss what's coming next.